Well, hey guys, thanks for checking out the video, and if you like videos like this, please be sure to subscribe to the channel.
What we've got here is failure to communicate. Some men you just can't reach. So you get what we had here last week, which is the way he wants it. Well, he gets it.
This is a brief timeline of the French and Indian War, how I understand it. The French and Indian War was a series of conflicts leading up to the eventual outbreak of the 7 Years' War. King Philip's War, sometimes called the First Indian War, or Metacom's Rebellion, was an armed conflict in 1675-1676 between a group of indigenous peoples of the northeastern woodlands against the English New England colonies and their indigenous allies. The war is named for Metacom, the Pocatinet chief and sachem of the Wampanoag, who had adopted the English name Philip because of the friendly relations between his father Massasoit and the Plymouth colony. The war continued in the most northern reaches of New England until they signed the Treaty of Casco Bay on April 12, 1678. King William's War, the first intercolonial war in France, was the North American theater of the 9 Years' War, also known as the War of the Grand Alliance, or the War of the League of Augsburg. The 9 Years' War was a European great power conflict from 1688 to 1697 between France and the Grand Alliance. Although largely concentrated in Europe, fighting spread to colonial possessions in the Americas, India, and West Africa. Related conflicts included the Williamite War in Ireland and the King William's War in North America. Queen Anne's War of 1702 to 1713 was the second in a series of French and Indian wars fought in North America, involving the colonial empires of Great Britain, France, and Spain. It took place during the reign of Queen Anne of Britain. In the United States, this is regarded as a standalone conflict under this name. Elsewhere, it is usually viewed as the American theater of war of the Spanish Succession. In France, it's known as the Second Intercolonial War. King George's War was a conflict over the domination of the North America, and it ends with no clear victor with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. King George's War is the name given to the military operations in North America that formed part of the War of the Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748. It was the third of the four French and Indian Wars. It took place primarily in the British provinces of New York, Massachusetts Bay, which included Maine, as well as Massachusetts at the time, New Hampshire, which included Vermont at the time, and Nova Scotia. Its most significant action, an expedition organized by Massachusetts Governor William Shirley that besieged and ultimately captured the French fortress of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia in 1745. In France, this is known as the Third Intercolonial War. In 1745, the Virginia House of Burgesses began granting western land to Virginia-based land companies. The French saw this as a threat to their territorial claims, which were based on early exploration and settlement. In 1752, France sent the Marquis de Duquesne to be the Governor-General of Canada and to command French forces in North America. Throughout the rest of 1752 and early 1753, the French built strategically placed forts throughout the Ohio Valley to protect their claims. The Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, was particularly vocal in calling upon the British government through the Privy Council to stop French incursions into the Ohio Valley. Dinwiddie had significant financial interest in the Ohio Company and may have seen his investment threatened. Colonel George Washington carries Virginia's ultimatum over French encroachment to Captain Legardot de Saint-Pierre at Rivière-aux-Boeufs, and he rejects it. Fort LaBeouf, often referred to as Fort de la Rivière-aux-Boeufs, was a fort established by the French during 1753 on the fork of the French Creek in the drainage area of the Ohio River in present-day Waterford in northwest Pennsylvania. The fort was part of a line that included Fort Presque Isle, Fort McCall, and Fort Duquesne. May 1754, Washington defeats the French in a surprise attack, the first battle, at Jumonville Glen, and builds Fort Necessity. The Battle of Jumonville Glen, also known as Jumonville Affair, was the opening battle of the French and Indian War, fought on May 28, 1754, near present-day Uniontown in Fayette County, Pennsylvania. A company of provincial troops from Virginia under the command of Lieutenant Colonel George Washington and a small number of Mingo warriors led by the chieftain Tanacharison, the Half-King, ambushed a force of 35 Canadian Frenches under the command of Joseph Colon de Jumonville. The French take Fort Necessity then at the Battle of the Great Meadows. It took place on July 3, 1754 in present-day Farmington in Fayette County, Pennsylvania. Washington is then blamed for the loss at Fort Necessity. He resigns. He will later return as a volunteer under the British authority. June 1755, the British seize Acadia, which is Nova Scotia. Then in July 1755, the Battle of Monongahela takes place. British General Edward Braddock forces are defeated near Fort Duquesne in Pennsylvania, leaving the backwoods of British territory undefended. The Battle of the Fort Duquesne, also known as the Battle of Monongahela, was a British defeat by French and Native Americans forces. On July 9, 1755, the battle took place during the French and Indian War. What happened? British General Edward Braddock led an expedition to capture Fort Duquesne from the French. The British force was including 1,400 infantry and 700 colonial militia. The French and Indian Native American forces was led by Captain Daniel Leonard de Bijou. The French and Native Americans used the forest to their advantage, concealing their fire and overwhelming the British. Braddock was mortally wounded and died during the retreat. The British force was routed and then retreated to Fort Cumberland. British Colonel William Johnson arrives at the Great Carrying Place to build a fortified storehouse. Work was already underway, led by Captain Robert Rogers. Colonel Phineas Lyman takes over to complete construction of Fort Lyman, which would later become Fort Edward. August of 1755, William Johnson arrives at Lac du Saint-Sacrement and renames it Lake George. He begins work on fortification to later be named what is Fort William Henry. William Johnson's forces are engaged in several battles that would collectively be named the Battle of Lake George. This would include the Bloody Morning Scout. The Bloody Morning Scout was an ambush that resulted in the death of British Colonel Ephraim Williams and Mohawk King Hendrick. A later engagement would be called the Battle of Bloody Pond. Johnson's forces win the day, making him the first British hero of the war. May 8th and 9th, 1756. The declarations of war. War is officially declared between Great Britain and France. The French and Indian War had begun. August 14th, 1756, Fort Oswego. The French captured this fort on the banks of the Great Lakes. March 1757, on St. Patrick's Day, an attack on Fort William Henry ends with the French defeat. August 3rd through 9th, 1757. The commander-in-chief of the French forces, Louis-Joseph Montcalm, lays siege to Fort William Henry, which Colonel Monroe finally surrenders. The infamous massacre occurs, later dramatized in James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans. After losing several battles in 1757, in a retaliation in particular for the massacre of British colonists by France's American Indian allies at Fort William Henry, that year the British went on the offensive in 1758 and sought to recapture strategic points held by the French, including Fort Carillon, or Ticonderoga. It was begun by French engineers in 1755 and still unfinished at the time of the battle. The British were nominally led by their Major General James Abercrombie, but the real leader of the troops was the energetic strategist Brigadier General Lord George Howe. The French were led by Major General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm. British forces and their American allies totaled some 15,000 to 16,000 men. The French army comprised of a mere 3,600, whom Montcalm's aide-de-camp Brigadier Louis Antoine de Bougainville complained that its soldiers lacked adequate training to form an effective fighting force. They attacked the fort on July 8th, taking a number of casualties. The day ended in defeat for the British and a victory for Montcalm, defending Ticonderoga. Lord Howe was killed. The army of about 3,600 men under General Marquis de Montcalm and the Chevalier de la Vie defeated a numerically superior force of British troops under General James Abercrombie, which frontally assaulted an entrenched French position without using field artillery, a lack that left the British and their allies vulnerable and allowed the French to win a complete victory. The battle was the bloodiest of the American theater of the war, with over 3,000 casualties suffered. July 25th, 1758, Louisbourg. The British seized Louisbourg, opening the route to Canada. The siege of Louisbourg was a pivotal operation of the French and Indian War in 1758 that ended French colonial dominance in Atlantic Canada and led to the subsequent British campaign to capture Quebec in 1759 and the remainder of New France the following year. August 27th, 1758. The French surrender Fort Frontenac on Lake Ontario, destroying their ability to communicate with their troops in the Ohio Valley. October 21st, 1758. Britain makes peace with the Iroquois, Shawnee, and Delaware Indians. The Treaty of Easton was a colonial agreement in North America signed in October 1758 during the French and Indian War between British colonials and the chiefs of the 13 Native American nations, representing tribes of the Iroquois, Lenape or the Delaware Indians, and the Shawnee. Negotiations over more than a week were concluded on October 26, 1758, at a ceremony held in Easton, Pennsylvania, between the British colonial governors of the provinces of Pennsylvania and New Jersey and representatives of 13 Indian nations, including the Iroquois, who sent chiefs of 3 of their nations to ensure their continued domination of their Ohio country region. The eastern and western Lenape, Delaware, represented by 2 chiefs and headman, and Shawnee and others. More than 500 Native Americans attended the outdoor ceremony after lengthy negotiations to bring peace to the regions of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and the Ohio country came to an end. The British recapture Fort Duquesne, and they rename it Fort Pitt or Pittsburgh. The Annus Mirabilis of 1759, meaning the wonderful year in Latin, was a string of notable British victories over their French-led opponents during that year. May 1st, 1759. The British capture the Fort Island of Guadeloupe in the Caribbean. June 25th, 1759. British take Fort Ticonderoga. July 25th, 1759. British take Fort Niagara. French abandon the Crown Point, and British now control the entire western frontier. September 13th, 1759. Quebec. British win the Battle of Quebec. Montcalm and Wolfe, then commanding generals of both armies, die in the battle. May 16th, 1760. The French siege of Quebec fails. The siege lasted from the 29th of April to the 15th of May, when British ships arrived to relieve the city and compelled the French commander, Francis de Gaston Chevalier de Levis, to break off the siege and to retreat. September 8th, 1760, Montreal falls to the British. Letters are signed finishing the surrender to Canada. September 15th, 1760, functional end of the war. This is the functional end of the war. The British flag is raised over Detroit, effectively ending the war. The peace and friendship treaties of 1760 and 61 were a series of agreements between the British and the Mi'kmaq people. The treaties were signed in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and ended a long period of conflict. The treaties were signed in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and ended a long period of conflict between the two groups. 1761, British make peace with the Cherokee Indians. After more than 3 years of hostilities, Cherokee Indians signed a treaty with South Carolina's Lieutenant Governor William Bull at Ashley's Ferry Town on September 23, 1761. At the time, the Europeans began to explore South Carolina. The Cherokees held most of the land in northwestern South Carolina. September 18, 1762, the French attempt to retake Newfoundland, but it fails. February 10, 1763, the Treaty of Paris. All French possessions east of the Mississippi, except New Orleans, are given to the British. All French possessions west of the Mississippi are given to the Spanish. France regains the islands Martinique, Guadeloupe, and St. Lucia. The French and Indian War marked a turning point in history. The expense of the war caused Britain to raise taxes in the colonies, leading to unrest and a resentment of the British monarchy. Just 13 years after the Treaty of Paris, the colonies rose up against the king in a war for independence, leading to the freedom of the colonies and the formation of the United States of America. Well, thank you guys for checking out this video, and if you like this video, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, smash that like button, and comment below. Comments are needed to get some information about what's going on in the video, what's liked, what's not liked. Start a conversation today. Become a part of the frontier. Smash that like button, share, like, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, guys. Always remember to get out there and explore.